Hello, everybody. My name's Kaz, and welcome to the very first official episode of Friendly Feedback. Today, we're going to be talking about Azerite gear. Now, as a brief reminder, this series serves basic purpose of identifying issues that exist within World of Warcraft, digging deeper as to what's wrong with them, and then trying to provide a little bit of feedback, some recommendations, and just general discussion on ways that we can improve upon the systems as a whole. We chose Azerite here because, quite frankly, in my opinion, going into Battle for Azeroth, Azerite is one of the biggest disappointments in terms of the things that were announced for this particular expansion. Now, before we get into what's wrong with it and how we make it better, we kind of need to effectively define what Azerite is. So, to start off with, Azerite is a new system in this particular expansion that was implemented with the specific purpose of kind of replacing legendaries from Legion, replacing tier gear that has existed all the way up until Legion, and then with the Heart of Azeroth neck piece, replacing the artifact weapons that we had. Azerite gear fills 3 primary slots, so that'll be your helm, your shoulders, and your chest piece. It'll only ever be in those 3 pieces, and with the exception of like a handful of greens that don't have anything on them, there's never any reason not to have a piece of Azerite gear equipped in those particular locations. It's worth noting that in these particular pieces of gear, you will only ever have primary stats, so in my case as a Warlock, Intellect and Stamina, and then you have the choice of actual Azerite traits. Azerite gear cannot Warforge or Titanforge, cannot be socketed, and the only item level difference you'll find is that at varying levels at the end of this year, as we'll get to later, you're able to give it a 5 item level increase. Originally, when Azerite gear came out, it contained 4 rings, and we've added an additional ring to kind of help with balance, and we'll go over that as some time goes on here. And then as previously stated, it was the new system that was designed to kind of replace tier gear and legendaries, which I would argue was for a reasonable, for a fairly good reason, in that originally, when you had legendaries and tier gear, it was very restrictive in terms of looking for gear upgrades, because it was not uncommon to have your 4 set and then have 2 legendaries, so 6 pieces of gear that basically you could never find an upgrade for. So Blizzard's decision was simply to make Azerite gear the only helm, shoulder, and chest that would drop, so it would never be competing for something else. Remove legendaries, which made all the other slots potentially viable upgrades as you were doing things. That has kind of come into contention with Benthic gear lately, but that's a whole nother story. So now that we have a basic understanding of what Azerite gear is, let's look a little bit deeper at the system. As we mentioned here, we've got various rings, and on this outer ring, the new things that were supposed to be kind of reminiscent of legendary traits was implemented. In this particular outer ring, you're going to have 6 options, for the Warlock at least, and it'll be 2 per spec. So we've got Flashpoint is one of the destruction options here, the other one being Chaotic Inferno. If you were to go down the Demonology tree, you would have Baleful Evocation and Explosive Potential, and then if you were going for Affliction, you have Cascading Calamity and Dreadful Calling. The inner ring then contains 4 options, 1 for each spec, and then 1 generic ring. So in this case, we've got Bursting Flames for Destruction, Inevitable Demise for Affliction, Shadow's Bite for Demonology, and then our generic trait on this particular piece of loot is Incite the Pack. The third ring in here is now all universal traits. There are slight variances between tanks, DPS, and healers, but as a DPS, they're all universal for me. They're not traits or spec specific. So I've selected Overwhelming Power here, with my other options being Gut Ripper and Blood Siphon. The fourth ring are largely defensive traits, so in this case, Gem Hide is equipped here. The other one being Vampiric Speed, and then the final ring, like we mentioned before, is a 5 item level boost to the piece of gear, which will then obviously increase the stats slightly, generically. That same design exists for the shoulders and for the chest, so it's just a matter of RNG, or I guess not RNG, in that each given piece of gear has fixed traits available to them, so you can target specific combinations if you're looking for particular things to work with. Now, let's start taking a look at why Azerite gear feels so bad, in my opinion, and I think that's not an uncommon opinion in general, talking with members of my guild, talking with other people I've run into in the community, and listening to some of the bigger streamers. I would argue that Azerite gear in general is not particularly well liked, and I think Blizzard has acknowledged that with a handful of changes they've made throughout the expansion thus far, and they're continuing to move in a direction that indicates that they're not satisfied with the way that Azerite gear is working. So first off, when it came out, one of the big issues, and I think is still one of the big issues that exists with Azerite gear, is balance. Simply put, some traits are borderline mandatory, while other traits are effectively dead traits. So when you're looking for a piece of Azerite gear to equip, there are some pieces of gear that, even if they're big item level upgrades, are considered to be basically worthless or meaningless because of the traits that you happen to get for that particular piece of gear. Case in point, recently with patch 8.2, there was a set of shoulders that was available for priests that didn't actually end up on the loot table due to a bug, and that particular piece of gear was so incredibly good that Blizzard was willing to refund residuum, which we'll get to in a second, for priests to have another chance to roll for it with it on the loot table, because they basically are acknowledging its massive imbalance in terms of how important it is, and the fact that it wasn't available when people spent their hard-earned residuum was a big enough deal to them that they were willing to refund and give people another chance with a properly functioning loot table, as where other specs who were impacted by the same lack of gear were not afforded the same chance for a reroll. Another issue that I think that exists is the difficulty in which it is to acquire particular pieces of gear. I'm standing right here next to all these ethereal guys for that very reason, because when it comes to Azerite gear, this gentleman is one of the main sources of said Azerite gear. So we come in here and you can see for residuum, which you basically earn by either scrapping or disenchanting existing pieces of Azerite gear, and from your weekly chests for Mythic Pluses, you can bank up a bunch. I've got 31,000 saved up, and then you can use it to purchase pieces of gear. You can see here for 1725 at this current point in time, I could buy a 415 piece. For 9,000, I could buy a 430 piece. For 4750, I could buy a 445 piece. Or for a whopping 200,000 residuum, I can go and I can buy a very specific piece of gear. And as we kind of look through here, we can see that there is a number of trait combinations between all of these, some much better than others. But my argument comes back to the difficulty in terms of acquiring them, because 200,000 is fairly difficult to acquire, even if you're aggressively pushing content. So most people, myself included, tend to go for the random roll, where I say, hey, I want a helm. I buy this piece for 47,500. I open it up, and it has a chance of one of these 6 helms. You could say, but you can get them from raid, and that's true. You go to the raid bosses, Eternal Palace being our most recent raid, and you'll see that there's usually a piece of Azerite gear of some kind on each of the raid bosses this year. So if I were to run Mythic difficulty, I can get a 445 chest from the first boss. If I go to Blackwater Behemoth, I can get 445 shoulders. If I need a helm, I can go to Radiance of Ajara. So that's true, but the issue then lies, are these good combinations? Looking here, if I'm playing Affliction, Inevitable Demise is decent, but Pandemic Evocation is not. Loyal to the End is good if a lot of people are running it, but Dreadful Calling is not. So if I was only in a guild that was able to access Radiance of Ashara, and this was my choice of 445 helms, the traits on it are quite frankly rather bad. So I'm kind of forced to gamble with this guy and hope that I roll better options here, or I save up a huge amount and try to buy a specific one that has the good pieces available. You can also do PvP and do your little weekly chest, and there's a chance that you'll get a piece of Azerite gear from that. But again, you're playing the RNG game and a pool of a bunch of different options, and the PvP gear has different prioritization or different sets of Azerite options on there. So it's difficult if I'm trying to put together, for instance, my Affliction rating set. I want to have Racking Brilliance on everything. Well, right here I've got 445 with Racking Brilliance, 435 shoulders with Racking Brilliance. But then I rolled on 445 and it wasn't available, so I don't have it. So I either have to re-roll or find a piece that may not exist from Raid to try to supplement that and get that on there. So it's not a particularly good system. It's very difficult to target what you're looking for, and because of the massive imbalances, you can end up getting completely screwed, or you can end up getting incredibly lucky when you're playing the gambling game. Another thing that I would say that an issue that exists with Azerite gear right now is that it fails to fill the void that was left behind with tier gear and legendaries. Legendaries, while difficult to acquire in a similar way, very RNG based and somewhat frustrating from time to time, did something that like made up for it in my mind, in that it gave you a lot of gameplay variance. The same thing could be said for tier gear. You equipped your 4 set and it usually changed your rotation in terms of the buttons you pushed, the abilities that did stuff. I remember playing Destruction and Legion. There was times where I was actually taking different talents as a result of the tier gear that we had on, because all of a sudden it was worthwhile to run some different combinations to actually use Roaring Blaze, which I believe was on a different talent tier, to do some stuff because of the way that the tier gear works. On the flip side, I would say Azerite gear doesn't have that interaction nearly as well. Like for instance, Flashpoint, it gives you a haste buff if you damage something with your immolate above 80%, which I guess can be useful in, like, for instance, a Mythic Plus or a boss fight that has a lot of ads, because you're actively targeting the high health mobs to proc this, the way that Shadow Priest would actively target execute level mobs to proc their damage buff or whatever. But I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a gameplay change, because in reality, you're almost always trying to put immolate for shard generation. It just happens to give you a benefit, makes you slightly more powerful in fights that have constant ad cleave or multi-target options. It doesn't change your rotation at all. It just emphasizes the fact that you want to put immolate on other things. Chaos shards here, incinerate damage is increased, so not a very interesting, because you're doing incinerate as filler anyway. And then when you fill up a soul shard, you have a chance to generate an additional one. So an RNG proc for slightly better shard generation. Again, a DPS gain, not a terrible talent, but there is nothing that I do gameplay-wise that changes as a result. I just happen to sometimes get an additional shard, which means maybe I squeak in another Chaos Bolt in one of my Infernal windows or something like that. So I don't think that Azerite has lived up to the expectation there in terms of its ability to fill the gap with both tier gear and legendaries coming out of Legion, because there was a lot of variance in terms of what you were able to do there, and we kind of took a lot of steps back in that regard. The other thing that I think is an issue, and we've already touched on it briefly, is Residuum. It was a band-aid fix at best, in my opinion, because originally, when the game launched, there was a chance for you to receive Azerite gear out of your Mythic Plus chest. And that felt bad in that some people were getting like Mythic quality Azerite gear week 1 and other people were not. And so there was a giant power disparity being created as a result of the Mythic Plus chest. So their fix was, let's make Residuum. Let's give you a currency that you can earn on a weekly basis through your Mythic Plus accomplishments. The higher the key you do, the more Residuum you get, and then you can spend it and purchase one of these either RNG rolls or a specific piece of gear over time, which at first was a great solution because the problem was insane and it was a way to provide some balance, but I don't think it was ever meant to last. And the way that the prices and stuff has inflated, it's become kind of ridiculous. And I'll go into the math here in a second with that. And then finally, I'd say one of the things is just that, frankly, it fails to live up to the hype. There was a lot of concerns about how it was going to work in terms of gearing. In beta, they assured us that it was a system that was going to function, and it's gone through a lot of iterations, a lot of buffs and nerfs to traits and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, I don't think anybody is particularly excited about it, and I find a lot of people missing legendaries, missing artifact weapons, and missing tier gear, and it's simply due to the fact that Azerite has not filled that void, like we said before. It's just not living up to the hype. So that brings us to the most important part of this whole segment. How do we fix this? What can we do? What kind of recommendations do we have? What things can we do within the game to fix this? And frankly, unfortunately, I would say at this point it's going to be difficult to completely fix, and I think it may be a 9.0 kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth talking about, because this system will either need to be replaced or redesigned in the future, or it's going to continue to drive the community mad. So let's talk about it as if we were given the responsibility of basically paving the path forward for Azerite gear. What would we do to make it better? So I would say, if I was tasked with this, my immediate fix would be one of two things. Either I would make it where acquisition was much more readily available, so that when you're looking at these massive disparities between the strength of the different abilities, that kind of becomes a thing of the past, because it's easy enough to acquire whatever the best in slot combination is. That would give people a more level playing field. It would create some of the envy, I guess, that people have, where one person rolls their Bis helm, the other guy rolls like the absolute garbage helm, and now all of a sudden you walk into raid together and one dude's doing 3, 4, 5k more damage than you are. Simply because they got better RNG on their roll. So if you made it more readily available, that problem goes away, because everybody would gain access to their best in slots or whatever. You would get these great combinations, you would have more options, and people would be able to play their class to the fullest. A viable solution, but at the end of the day, you're basically giving gear out, and that doesn't always feel good. The other option is to put a much more aggressive approach into balancing the traits. The fact that I look at some of these pieces of gear and just laugh at the options that are available, like we were looking at this one earlier, the helm, right? Dreadful Calling is, like, when you look at the Sims and stuff, it's just not a thing that you really consider all that much. The Unstable Affliction damage, buff it a little bit. Make it worth your while, because UA is a big part of your rotation. If you were to buff that more, make that more aggressive, then all of a sudden, hey, I'm stacking a lot of UAs, I'm getting haste off of Cascading Calamity, maybe Dreadful Calling starts being useful. And also the reduction in Dark Glare. Dark Glare is a big part of the rotation, but it's not everything. So 1 second reduction isn't all that amazing, but if you were to make it a better reduction, you start pairing that with stuff like Visions of Perfection, and now you're creating maybe 2-minute Dark Glare windows, so now you can line up your Dark Glare with your Dark Soul Misery or something like that. Simple things like that, simple tuning tweaks, give you the option to make some of these things that were laughable viable, where now all of a sudden this piece of gear that was considered garbage before, now it's not. Now I have a different combination, and maybe it means that I build slightly differently. I use a different combination with essences or something like that, but at the end of the day, I don't feel bad that I just spent, 47,000 residuum on a piece of gear that I'm just like, well, I'm forced to equip it because I spent so much on it, but at the end of the day, I much would have preferred any of the other 5, you know? So those are kind of the two things that I think needs to be done ASAP if you're looking to kind of fix it. More long-term things that we're kind of looking at, there's a lot of things to address. Looking at my notes here, some other stuff we talked about. So here's something to consider as well. In beta, I believe there was a period of time when you did your Mythic Plus chest, it was dropping 2 or 3 pieces of gear out of the box at a time, and there was widespread speculation that if you did a Mythic Plus, it would give you a piece of gear that was not Azerite, so you get a ring or some boots or a trinket or a weapon or something like that, and a guaranteed piece of Azerite gear. And that goes back to the availability thing. If that was the case, if every week you were getting a piece of Azerite gear, then all of a sudden you're not worrying about traits as much. But for whatever reason, they got rid of that, and it stopped being a thing. So perhaps going back to a system like that would be would have the potential to be a little bit more useful. The RNG aspect of it, I get that it's an MMORPG and RNG is inherent to the system that we play here. But I think it's one of those things where, as a player, when there's RNG, you want it to be targetable RNG. So if we look back, like with Classic, that's the easy example because World of Warcraft Classic is right around the corner, right? So with Classic, we go into Molten Core, we're pushing our way up and we're killing Ragnaros, right? Now, I know that there is an RNG chance at any one of these pieces of gear dropping. Let's say that I really, really want these pants because they're my tier nemesis leggings. I know that there's, in a 40-man raid, there's a relatively low chance that they drop, and if it does drop, I'm going to be rolling against it or using DKB or whatever with another Warlock trying to get them. But they're still really good pants for me. So it's targetable. I'm coming in, I'm killing Rag, and I know that that's available to me, which is awesome. And that's RNG that I can somewhat control, because if you kill Rag enough, eventually those pants are going to drop and you're going to be the only Warlock left, or you're going to be the Warlock who happens to roll high enough and you're going to be able to get it. On the flip side, right now, we're rolling RNG, and I guess you could say if I were to roll this chest, let's see, or helm, right? So we got 6 helms here. Probability says if I roll 6 helms, I would likely have all 6 helms, but we know that that's not 100% going to happen. I could roll the same helm numerous times. And it starts getting a little bit ridiculous when you're trying to look at that. So let's take a look here. I did some of the math and I'm pulling it up right now. So if I was running a Mythic Keystone at a level of 20 or higher, so I'm doing a plus 20 every week so that I'm getting the residuum from that, and I wanted to buy a specific piece of gear, the 200,000 gear, it would take me 7.7 weeks of running that 20 key every week in order to buy a specific piece of gear. So 8 weeks before I can get one piece of targeted gear. Same thing, but I'm doing plus 10s because I'm not as good of a player. It's harder to get a group. Whatever the case may be, I don't have the time commitment to do 20s. I'm running 10s. It's going to take me 11.7 weeks. So 12 weeks to buy one piece of specific gear, targeted gear. That's a little brutal, considering a lot of times we're looking at the 77-day cycle or whatever, which is like 11 weeks. So basically, we're looking at potentially patch 8.25 coming out, and I've got one piece of Azerite gear to show for it if I'm running plus 10s. That just doesn't feel good, right? Like that's not meaningful progression if this is the main way to get your gear. So I think they need to look at their Band-Aid fix. They need to assess, because we don't want it just readily available. You just run a 10 key and all of a sudden, boom, you've got 3 pieces of Mythic gear. That's not what I'm saying. I think that if you're running 3, 4, 5 weeks of plus 10s, you should have a more easy option to target something, or if I were to scrap it, it should be worth more. So if I get a bad piece of gear, I take it to the scrapper, I take it to the disenchanter, and it refunds me some, I should get a significant amount, so it's much easier to go back and rebuy and try again without being penalized too much. So those are potential options in terms of just, if we don't change the system at all, but we're trying to make it so that the player base, is able to access it a little bit better. I think those are things that would be useful. Another thing is looking at PvP gear, right? There's not a great way to get PvP gear. You're doing your weekly stuff. You're filling up your conquest bar. I already did. It was a trinket this week, I think, or whatever. But we've had one piece of Azerite gear so far in this patch cycle. So I guess you can keep it. I think I disenchanted it because it was 415. It wasn't particularly good. But I guess I could have kept that in my bag. And then given time, when I get the little upgrades where you can boost it using your quartermaster coins or whatever, I can boost it from a 415 to a 430, and then eventually boost that same piece of gear to a 445. But again, that's a fairly laborious process to get a single piece of gear, and you have to push pretty high to get enough of those quartermaster coins and stuff to actually be doing meaningful stuff there. And if you're a PvPer and you don't have access to raid, or you're not running Mythic Pluses, like, I feel bad for those guys, because getting decent PvP gear, if you're not a well-geared toon and you're trying to push the ladder and stuff, that's just rough. Like, that's truly rough. So a PvP vendor that allows you to spend honor points or to spend marks of honor or something to target and upgrade and boost in a similar way, I think those are things that would give us options, because it's just more varieties of targetable, fixed ways to actually get the gear in the hands of players. The other thing that's kind of funny, so that I put down and just thinking about it, is we're looking here at our vendor, right? The only targetable gear is the 445 gear. So what if I decide to myself, look, I'm not a Mythic Raider. I'm an AOTC Raider, or I'm a normal Raider, but there are traits that I want to try to push, and I want to be the best at the level that I'm doing. So if I wanted to target a 415 or a 430 piece, that simply doesn't exist. Now, yes, it's a lot cheaper. It's only 9,000, so right now I could buy 3 of them. And I'd have a chance at getting one of them. at the end of the day, like the fact that I can't go in and I can't target, like, if I really want, I don't know, this Stormlurker's Cowl. Let's say that I really want that because I really want Racking Brilliance to go along with Tidal Surge, which I don't think Tidal Surge is actually all that good, but maybe that's my target build or something like that. Why can't I buy it at a lower level? Like, that seems a little bit funny to me that they're forcing you, like, oh, if you want something good, it must be Mythic, and we're going to make it insanely expensive. So, I don't know, something to consider there. That just feels a little bit wonky to me, and perhaps opening that up, I know these pages would be absolutely ridiculous, so maybe you have several vendors, the normal vendor, the heroic vendor, the mythic vendor, so that you can kind of have the appropriate versions amongst them so that you don't have to sort through 15 pages of stuff as you're trying to find whatever piece of gear you want. That's a potential option to, make that a little bit more manageable. But stuff like that, just, again, trying to get the Azerite gear into the hands of players, I think smooths out a lot of that frustration, even though the traits are still somewhat lackluster, even if you're able to get your best in slot ones. Another thing that I think is wrong that I didn't mention that we need to kind of consider is respecking. So this is very spec changing unfriendly, right? So I'm going into raid right now. You can see I'm wearing 3 pieces of gear, obviously. So I've got my helm, my shoulders, and my chest. I'm in Destruction spec because I was doing some PvP and some World PvP and stuff. But I raid in Affliction. So in my bags now I've got my 3 sets for Affliction. I do Mythic Pluses as Demonology. So in my bag I've got my Demonology. But I've also experimented with a little bit of Affliction in Dungeon. So I have a couple of extra pieces that are more dungeon-friendly traits there. While also experimenting with some stuff in Arena. So I've got extra pieces. Now I've got a ton of pieces in my bag because it's difficult to swap out between all this stuff. Now, I'm not opposed to carrying around different sets. That's a thing that used to exist. That's part of the game. And, like, the reality is, if I'm a casual player, I only like Affliction. I only like Destruction. I need all I need is my 3 pieces, and I'll probably be able to do most everything with those at whatever level it is. And as you push higher, it's not unreasonable to expect that a higher level player needs to be more specific with their stuff, and that means carrying extra sets. But if I'm in the middle of raid, and let's say, we're doing actual content here in this expansion. So I'm doing Ajara's Eternal Palace. I'm using Affliction because it's crushing on Orgazoa or whatever, or I'm using Demonology to burn ads and stuff. But now we're kind of like Queen's Court, which is a 2-target boss fight. And you go, I really want to play Destruction on this. But the pieces of gear I have good Destruction and Affliction traits. Well, I can't use a tome to change that, so I have to leave the raid, I have to come here, and I have to talk to this guy to do my Azerite Reforge, and then I have to get summoned back. On top of that, there's a gold cost associated. Now, it's not a big deal, as you can tell, because I don't change pieces of gear that often. It's only 5 gold, but every time I do it, it doubles. So I respec my helm because I'm switching over to Destruction for this fight. That's 5 gold. I respec my shoulders because I'm respecing to Destruction. That's 10 gold, so we're up to 15. Do it for my chest. That 10 gold becomes 20, so now we're at 35. Still, excuse me, not a whole lot of gold, but let's say I want to run a Mythic Plus afterwards, and now I want to go to Demonology. So now instead of 20, the next one's 40. The next one's 80, and the next one's 160. Let's say the next day we're going back into raid. So I go back to Destruction. So now that 160, we're up to 320. And then, so on and so forth. And so we're spending our 3 to get back to a Destruction for that fight. Now we've progressed past that, and we go to Zakul, and let's say all of a sudden we're like, well, no, we need to play Afflictions. Now I got to use those same three pieces of gear. In the course of a couple of days, you look at the Limit guys, you look at the Method guys, you look at the Race for World First guys. Some of them were spending hundreds of thousands of gold. There was literally a guy in Method, I believe, that his respec cost went above gold cap, so he literally could not respec a single piece of gear. And it's not tied to a piece of gear. So it's not like if I respec this helm 8 times, it becomes expensive, but I can just swap helms and figure it out. This is literally any piece of gear. The cost goes up. So he was just straight up stuck with whatever he had. Now, getting gold out of the game because there's so much gold available, not the worst thing in the world. This is a bit of a gold sink. And the only people that are going to be using it that much are the more aggressive raiders, which are usually the ones that have a bit more gold because they're doing a lot of stuff in the game. I get that, but I kind of wish that there was a gold cap, the way that respecking back in Classic, it got expensive. We're talking like 50 gold for a talent respec, but it stopped there. So if you wanted to do it a bunch of times for the course of a raid tier or something like that, it's going to continue to be expensive, but it's not necessarily going to become completely unmanageable to the point that it's easier to reroll a new character than it is to respec the one you're on. I think there should be a similar cap in place when it comes to those rerolls. if that's the system they want to employ. Frankly, I think in terms of this world of, they want you to the player to have control and for you to be able to swap and play what you want. I think this whole system is basically designed to prevent you from playing what you want. And I think either using one of these like Tome of the Tranquil Mind, or maybe creating a engineering thing that allows you to break the armor or something like that. I don't know, create some lore relevant reason as to why you create a crafted piece that allows you to redo your Azerite. I think that's a more appropriate approach to things. But again, it is what it is, I guess. Again, balance. Balance is ridiculous. So here's some stuff I was looking up, right? Looking at Blood Mallet. So if you're a big modern WoW player, retail WoW player, and you're doing a lot of sims and stuff like that, you're probably familiar with Blood Mallet, which is a website that basically runs sims for Azerite pieces, trinkets, things of that nature, and then given a default build. So obviously it's a little bit biased because everybody's stat weights are going to be a little bit different. But using a default build then runs and rank orders based on DPS your best and worst Azerite pieces. So here's an example. At item level 445, so all the pieces were the same eye level. Looking at Affliction on Blood Mallet, the difference for a single piece of gear, for a single trait, between the best and the worst trait was 1,587 DPS. Now, because you can't have the same trait twice in a single piece of Azerite gear, you're not going to necessarily going to be able to double that or whatever. But if you're looking at like one of the inner rings or whatever here, where you've only got one option for your spec, and you happen to have like two of the worst, and there's another piece of gear that has two of the best, you could be looking at a roughly 1,500 DPS difference just because of the particular piece of gear that you rolled off the residuum vendor or whatnot. That's a little bit nutty. Trait stacking rather. So when you stack 3 of the same trait or whatever, if you have 3 of the best versus 3 of the worst at item level 445, the difference in DPS is 4,000 DPS. So you could be equally good player, you can be doing your rotation just as good, but the gear that you get because of the RNG rolls on it can be up to a 4,000 DPS difference. That's pretty staggering in terms of the imbalance. And again, those are obviously fringe cases. I'm using the absolute extremes. And in most cases, they're going to be much less egregious. But the fact that that possibility exists shows to me that Blizzard isn't putting as much time as they could in terms of balancing the traits as they want to, or they probably should be. Here's another thing to think about. When we're looking at specific traits, another thing I would do if I was looking to fix it is I would have somebody that's more familiar with all of the traits come in and try to redesign and look at some of them. So like we were talking about, I already gave the example of potential ways to make Dreadful Calling a little bit better by either boosting the AF damage or, more interestingly, I think, making the reduction in the Dark Lair summons times more significant or easier to track so that you could line it up with things like Visions of Perfection and create a 2-minute Dark Lair theoretically, which could be really cool because now you can line up trinkets along with your Dark Soul Misery and your Dark Lair to create gigantic Affliction burst windows along the way. But that trait just simply isn't strong enough to create that condition as it exists right now. Another one that I was looking at, let's see if I can find a piece of gear that has it. There it is. Pandemic Evocation. So Pandemic Evocation, in theory, sounds really cool. And when I saw it was announced, I think it came out in 8.1, I was like, this could be really fun. So the idea here is refreshing Corruption, Agony, or Siphon Life with less than 5 seconds remaining is going to deal a burst of damage, in this case 1,700 shadow damage, and has a 6% chance to grant you a Soul Shard. Now, if you're not familiar with Warlock play, you're a melee DPS, you're a healer or something like that, and pandemic windows aren't fresh in your mind, basically, at some point earlier in WoW's life, what happened was for dot classes, Affliction being one of the more potent ones, they created a thing called a pandemic window, where when you were down to, like, I believe it was the last 30% of the duration of a dot, you could reapply that particular dot, and you wouldn't lose any time. So it would keep that 30% plus add the full duration of the dot. So like in this case in Destruction, if I was using Immolate, Immolate's an 18-second dot, so if I were to do it with 30% left, I would get that full 18 seconds plus however much in that 30% window I had left. So let's say I did it with 5 seconds remaining in the case of Pandemic Evocation, which doesn't apply to Destruction, but just for simplicity's sake, we say 5 seconds. Now it becomes a 23-second dot or whatever and allows me to go about my rotation. So I was like, oh, that's really cool because that's what I want to be doing most of the time as Affliction. I want to be refreshing during pandemic windows because otherwise, if I'm refreshing early, I'm using a global cooldown to reapply a dot and I'm not getting the full duration dot damage in there. So that time spent would have been better spent casting a Shadow Bolt, doing another dot, casting an Unstable Affliction or something. The problem is, when we look at Pandemic Evocation, is this is a default 5-second window that they're giving us, which is not actually the pandemic window. So in the case of actual AF dots, so when we're looking between Corruption, Agony, and Siphon Life, the pandemic window is either 4.2 seconds all the way up to 5.4 seconds. So you can get tricked into, like, I could technically be applying in the pandemic window if I were to refresh at 5.2 seconds on, I think it's Agony. I could be actually proccing that pandemic window, doing everything right, but not proccing Pandemic Evocation because I'm not within the 5-second window. On the flip side, with, I believe it's Corruption, if I cast at 5 seconds, I'd be proccing Pandemic Evocation, but the actual pandemic window in that case is actually 4.2 seconds, so I'd actually be wasting a second. Really small stuff, min-maxy, but at the end of the day, instead of utilizing the true pandemic window, they're creating these artificial one, which if you're used to playing a certain way or you got weak auras set up for different stuff, may throw you off slightly. The other issue with Pandemic Evocation is that it definitely punishes refreshing your dots while moving. Since we've gotten rid of life tap since Legion, a lot of the time while playing Affliction, what you do, if there's some sort of raid mechanic that's going on that forces me to move a long distance, because I can't cast while I'm moving, what I will do is while I'm repositioning, if this side of the room is blowing up, while I'm repositioning to the other side of the room, I'm going to recast my Corruption, my Siphon Life, and my Agony, so that when I get here, all those dots are full duration, and now I can go into casting Shadow Bolts, casting Unstable Afflictions, casting Haunt, things of that nature, and I'm not wasting GCDs because I've already reestablished those dots along the way, because I can't do any damage otherwise, so I might as well reapply them on my move over here, and then go into my rotation as if they're fresh. But if I do that, Pandemic Evocation isn't going to be proccing, and as a result, I'm missing out on all of the damage that trait brings. The other thing that is going to be punished with Pandemic Evocation is the fact, like, let's consider if I took Absolute Corruption, right? Let's see, where's my piece at? Yeah, so if I take Absolute Corruption, Corruption cannot be refreshed and has no pandemic window because once you apply Corruption, Corruption becomes permanent. So I'm no longer able to proc Pandemic Evocation off of Corruption. Agony, I will, because you can always refresh that. But by taking Absolute Corruption, I remove the option for Siphon Life since they're in the same talent row. So if I take AC, literally the only way to proc Pandemic Evocation is with Agony. So that has anti-synergy against an Absolute Corruption build, which is quite useful on a handful of raid fights and is kind of the go-to in Mythic Pluses. The other problem is if I'm not running that, if I'm running Siphon Life or whatever the case may be, and I'm doing big AoE pulls, let's say like in a Mythic Plus, if I'm using Seed of Corruption to reapply my Corruption, last I tested, it didn't actually count as a pandemic reproc, and it wouldn't give you any pandemic evocation proc. So things you could do for this particular trait, and I know we're spending a lot of time on one trait, but I think this kind of deep level analysis and critique needs to be applied to essentially every single Azerite trait, and there's things that can be done to make them all more meaningful and interesting. So in the case of pandemic evocation, you should make it where it varies based on your talent choice. So if I choose Agony, or I choose Absolute Corruption, where Agony is the only way to refresh it, then perhaps the damage amount that goes on it scales upwards. Or my Soul Shard generation chance increases as a result of it. If I choose to go with Corruption, or with Siphon Life, which is a more difficult, debatably, a more difficult build to go with in terms of maintaining uptime on all your dots, so you're hitting all your pandemic windows, that's a harder balance to strike, especially as you get more and more targets, then I should be rewarded for that by getting a bunch of those procs or whatever, but I shouldn't be punished if I take Absolute Corruption because it's literally unmanageable. I think Siphon Light, or a Seed of Corruption rather, should be able to proc Pandemic Evocation, because imagine how crazy that would be if you're in a Mythic Plus, right? You throw a Seed of Corruption in there, you start spreading all of your Agonies around, you refresh Corruption with Seed of Corruption, and you get every single one of like a 10 mob pull to proc this pandemic evocation at once. Now, not only are you extending your corruption dot, you're reapplying a dot to everything in there, but you're getting mad pandemic procs. What if Pandemic Evocation also did a small burst of AoE? So now you could use Seed of Corruption in a way where with giant Mythic Plus pulls, if you're actually timing it right to hit those pandemic windows and popping it in the right window, you're doing just ridiculous amounts of AoE, but it's not a guaranteed thing the way that like the Seed of Corruption talent on the old Azerite trait where you just spammed it and it blew up and you did like all the damage in the world because of Shadow Flame. Instead, this one takes a little bit of timing and skill, so a good player is going to be able to utilize it well, get a ton of value, like especially on heavy trash fights or Mythic Pluses, but a lesser player may have some issues trying to push through some of that stuff and getting stuff going along the way. So things to consider there. That's just one example, but Pandemic Evocation is definitely one of the ones that I'm not particularly enthused about, that I think could be turned into a very fun talent, and that would change the way you play as a result. You'd actually you'd be rewarded heavily for refreshing in pandemic windows and utilizing seed and stuff like that, and you could actually get a big DPS boost from it. So if we were to think through all of those, I think that's something that a Blizz designer, you literally need somebody that is a Warcraft or a Warlock Theory Crafter to sit down and lock through every single one of these traits and figure out what's going to be the way to improve it. And if you did that, I think instantly you can make Azerite gear a lot more desirable. Other stuff we talked about. So like I said before, there's no game-changing abilities really the way that Legendaries and Tier Gear did. So for the most part, we've been stuck with the exact same rotation from day 1 until day now. We're at patch 8.2. We're a year into the expansion. I haven't changed the way that I play Affliction effectively at all. And that was something that Tier Gear did good, was you got Tier Gear from, or did well rather, but you got Tier Gear from the different tiers of raid that you went through, and there was something usually that changed your rotational abilities slightly so that there was some variance in the way that you played a particular class. It kept things feeling fresh, it kept things, feeling diverse or whatever, and it kind of prevented you from getting just completely bored with any given class. The other thing that I think you could do to spice up the Azerite gear is take a better look at the raid traits or whatever. So like, for instance, here we got Bonded Souls. Interesting, but at the end of the day, wasn't insane, and it wasn't impactful or interesting enough for a lot of people to take it. I think you could do a lot more fun stuff. Like, I think Uldir was probably our best example in terms of useful stuff because you had the re-origination array or whatever, where as long as you killed a certain number of bosses each week, that particular piece of Azerite gear gave you a buff to whatever your highest secondary stat was. So every single week you walked into Uldir, you were feeling more and more and more powerful. That was interesting. That was fun. That was potentially game-changing because now all of a sudden if Mastery is my highest stat, now it's insanely high, so now I'm trying to balance things a little bit, and with weird procs on your enchants or whatever, where all of a sudden Haste is the proc, so Haste is the highest, now all of a sudden you have a crap ton of Haste. It allowed for some variance in the way that you looked at things, the way you were statting things and doing stuff. It was a fun ability that I think we have not really seen since. Another thing you could do is do more dungeon specific stuff. So like a lot of these pieces, some of the dungeon pieces or whatever, are dungeon themed. So like Incite the Fact is themed from a dungeon, but it doesn't actually directly relate to any dungeon stuff in a meaningful way. I think that is a really big missed opportunity. If this empowered me in dungeons, then I'd be more inclined to shoot for dungeon gear via Residuum and the Residuum vendor, and then maybe that would help me progress Mythic Pluses because I'm getting bonus abilities while running dungeons with dungeon gear. I'm getting bonus abilities in raid while doing raid stuff. I'm getting bonus abilities for PvP if I'm using PvP Azerite gear. And then that helps fix other problems, and without going a lot into it, consider like the issues that we have where a lot of arena people are complaining about the strength of stuff like PvE trinkets and PvE gear. Well, if now you start having Azerite stuff that is specific to PvP, that is incredibly strong in PvP, it's useful but not overpowered outside of it. Now I could get a piece of PvP gear, bring it to raid and not be garbage, But if I'm looking to really push like a gladiator rank or something like that, I need the PvP stuff because it's going to help me out. The same way, if I'm looking to push, cutting edge, I probably want the raid gear, because if you made the raid traits meaningful enough, now there's a reason to push for all that stuff. And yeah, maybe it's helpful in Mythic Plus, but it's not overpowered. Again, in Mythic Plus, if I'm a big M Plus guy, I'm looking to push plus 20s or something like that. If there was a meaningful, useful, cool, fun dungeon talent that helped me push dungeons, now if I'm doing higher keys, getting that residual, and buying those dungeon pieces, I'm rewarded, and it's this kind of loop where it makes the dungeons easier so I can push a little bit harder, and it fits whatever my playstyle is. And again, that PvP or that dungeon gear maybe is useful in PvP, useful in raid, but it's not the best, so you're not forced to necessarily run Mythic Plus if you don't want to, but it is a stopgap or a filler if you're not able to get good RNG and get that roll on that Azerite gear from that raid boss or whatever. Those are things that we used to have with secondary stats, PvP vendors and stuff that had kind of disappeared from the game. And I thought Azerite was a system that had the potential to work off of that, but they never really dug into it. They never really bought into the system that they created, and they didn't take advantage of it in a way that I think they should have. At this point, those are kind of my ideas of things that you could do to fix the system without a big redesign, but I want to pivot here slightly, as there's rumors and leaks and all kinds of talk about 8 or 9.0 and stuff like that. So if Blizzard has truly given up on Azerite gear, which some people are of the opinion they have, I don't think they've given up. I just don't think they know how to fix it. And the easy solution is just continue to make small changes and then get rid of it in 9.0 and do something new. But if they want to keep Azerite gear, if they're stuck in their idea of not bringing back tier gear, we don't need a bunch of legendaries, here's an idea that I have in terms of a way that we could potentially look at and redesign Azerite gear, potentially in a 9.0 type scenario that would actually be kind of fun if you were to ask me. So I'm going to put a design here on screen. Pardon my Photoshop abilities here. There's not a whole lot of beauty in what we're doing, but I'm taking the pre-existing piece of Azerite gear and basically covering over a bunch of stuff and doing my own thing with it. So what I think is an interesting idea is because something that I would say that BFA was lacking was any sense of meaningful progression as well, right? We leveled from 110 to 120 and you really didn't gain a whole lot. You were dumping a ton of Azerite gear in to unlock full-blown rings and then re-unlocking them over time, which wasn't particularly fun. So what if instead we did a thing where, like the Heart of Azeroth, our neck piece, or like our weapons in BFA, or in Legion rather, you just get 3 generic pieces. You get a helm, you get a shoulder, you get your chest. And it's a one-time piece that you'll carry over, like this is your new... your new artifact in the next expansion, if they want to keep it that way. And what we do is, as we go through, we're going to probably be grinding out Azerite power, or artifact power, or old god power, whatever you want to call it, like some sort of continuous grind, because they seem to like that system as well. So what if, as we grind, we unlock individual nodes instead of full-blown tiers? So you can see listed on the top left there, I've got a number 5 on that particular node, and I have next to it max level. So I'd say that as you're leveling, you don't have access to any of this stuff necessarily. You're earning some AP, you're working on your levels, but we don't really unlock the system until you hit max level. So you do a quest chain, you get max level, you get enough AP to get to AP level 5, whatever it is, and you unlock that first node. And what that node is that's a blank node, kind of like a gem socket or whatever, where I now have the option to go, and because this is in the outer ring, this is what I'm deeming the class skill ring, if you look at the top right there, where you can see all the icons for Affliction, Demonology, and Destruction. And what I get to do with that one spot is I get to look at all of the class options that are available to me, and I get to choose which one I put in there. So if right now I'm a fresh level 130 or whatever it is that we're going for, I'm in this new world, and I'm leveling as Destruction, or I'm playing as Destruction, because quite frankly, with War Mode on, Destruction is probably the most efficient of the 3 specs in the open world. So I'm like, okay, what do I want to do for Destruction? And I decide that I want to use Crashing Chaos, because the reduction time in Infernal is really useful. The bonus damage after I drop Infernal is great, and so that's what I want to use when I'm out in the world. So I slot that in. Now I've got 3 pieces of gear. I would argue that I think it's worth only being able to equip one of these traits at any given time. I don't like stacking a bunch of them because the imbalance becomes even more egregious, as we were looking at beforehand. So I put that into my shoulders. I look at my helm and I go, well, you know what? Flashpoint's really good where I'm questing because I'm usually pulling a lot of new ads. So in my helm, in that level 5 slot, I throw in Flashpoint. And then on my chest or whatever, I look and I go, well, Chaos Shards is great. Being able to proc extra shards at random points in time to extend Infernal windows, awesome. So I choose those 3 because those are my best 3. And now I'm able to continue going on. I can start going into dungeons. I can start doing early raid content and stuff like that. Now, next at level 7, we go into the second tier, which is what I'm deeming the raid, PvP, Mythic Plus tier or whatever. So in that ring, I'm not going to have any class abilities at all. Instead, I'm only going to have the options of the stuff that comes from raid, comes from PvP, or comes from dungeons. So you can see on the right-hand side there, I've got the laser matrix and like whatever the other one from Uldir is. You got Bonded Souls, you've got Arcane Heart, all those ones. So if my goal and my focus is raiding today, then I'm going to slot in whatever the raid specific one is that I want, and I'm going to put that in there. If I'm doing a lot of PvP, I'm going to look at the PvP ones. And again, I've already talked about how I think they need a redesign, but I would make more powerful, useful PvP ones and put those in there. And if I'm a big Mythic Plus guy, then I'm going to take one of those dungeon-specific ones. And I would say that whichever one it is, it should be boosting you in whatever you do. So that if you're raiding, you take something that's going to help you out with raiding. If you're doing dungeons, you're going to take something that helps you out with dungeons. Now, there's a catch to this, because that seems too easy, right? We throw in all this raid stuff, and now we're powerful in raid. Well, that's too easy. Yeah, probably is. But we've already talked about how this is kind of our new artifact, and we're taking up 3 slots with it. So what if, in those particular slots, there's really cheesy kind of, base level, uninteresting default ones that you can put in there at first? But what if there's drops from bosses? Or, like the Essence system, what if there's predetermined ways that I can, through achievements or through certain accomplishments or through, some sort of, I don't know, something that you do in game, there's some way that I can go and I can unlock additional stuff as I progress further. So let's say, kill a Jara on normal, and now that unlocks some new raid trait. Kill a Jara on heroic and get AOTC, and you get another one. Kill a Jara on mythic, and there's another one, and they're more and more powerful. So as you progress through, you're unlocking new stuff, and it's giving you options, and they're cool and they interact. So it's now targetable. And it's something that makes you want to progress. And the way that Essences have done a great job, I've done a lot more PvP and stuff. Like if you look here, I've got rank 4 Purification Protocol, which is pure RNG, but I grinded my reputation for it. Essence of the Focusing Hour. So I do a fair amount of Mythic Plus. That was going to happen anyway, but I got my rank 3 because I pushed my 10s every week. Lucid Dreams, that's more world questing and follower stuff or whatever. Ripple in Space, though, that was from doing a bunch of the Called Arms quests. So I'm not huge on world PvP, but there was an essence tied to it. It's garbage, but what if they buff it? What if they nerf it? What if they change it? Well, I want to have my hands on that because I want to be the WoW player that's ready no matter what happens. So I went out and I did my 2 Call to Arms quests every single week, and I got my rank 3 Ripple in Space. So if you did something similar where you had abilities that were available to you via the like a system like that, like the Essences or whatever, now we're unlocking cool raid stuff, and because I'm going and I'm doing raid gear, I'm opening up raid options. If I'm doing Mythic Pluses, timing a 10 gets you something. Doing specific dungeons, complete one of every dungeon gives you something. Little things along the way that open up options. I think that's a great way to get players to experience more of the game at large, and to go in there and try different stuff, and then it enhances your gameplay abilities. So I've got, moving along here, since we're already getting kind of long here, looking at the number 9 slot that I've got on there. That's in the next ring, which is I'm just calling the minor ring. And we're just looking at those minor abilities. Again, they're small things like Overwhelming Power, Gut Ripper, whatever the case may be. You take a look at that and you go, hey, one of these procs Mastery. Mastery is my best stat. I'm going to take that. I'm going to throw it in there. Gives me a little Mastery, gives me a little Leech, gives me a little boost to my damage overall. It doesn't have to be anything overwhelming, but it's going to make you feel more powerful. Maybe you're doing a fight where leech is helpful. Maybe you're doing something where execute's more helpful. Now you swap out between those and you put in whatever's going to help you out in any particular situation. We go on to the 11 tier. That's our defensive tier. So now I'm looking, and the default is going to be our Prydes bubble or whatever, probably. But if you were to buff everything else or balance things again, surprise, surprise, in a way that they're all equally useful, now I have different options. Gem Hide is if I take a big hit, I get a bunch of armor. So maybe if it's a fight it's going to truck me and armor is useful, then I take that. If in general I just want an absorb shield to help prevent me from getting dazed or just a little bit of padding on my health, then I'm going to take the shield. If it's something where a Mythic Plus where I'm murdering tons of stuff and I'm getting a heal off of everything that dies near me, maybe that's useful because it'll help get rid of Grievous stacks or something like that. So now I can put whatever makes sense in there. And then finally, past the defensive ring, I've got the eye level boost, and that's not going to happen until we get to like level 70 or something like that. And we'll get to that in a bit. But you can see, so I've got one of each, right? So those will be slotted in. That's my one piece. Well, what about all those others? Why is there anything else in there? Well, in my mind, we still have the gold respec, right? Where if you want to completely reforge your Azerite piece, it deletes everything from that particular piece of gear and allows you to reslot stuff in. But now, let's say once I get to 15, we're back on the outer ring, we're on the class ring. Once I get to 15, I open up a second node. So now I'm still playing Destruction, but I throw in the Havoc one, Rolling Havoc. So if I'm on a 2-target cleave fight, now all I've got to do is use a respec tome, and I have the option between my unlocked 5 and my unlocked 15, and now I can reslot. I'm going 2-target, okay, awesome, Rolling Havoc, that's the go-to. Oh, it's single target, so Rolling Havoc has no value. I'm going to use a tome, I'm going to respec, and I'm going to put in something that's more single target based. Or, let's say I want to swap between Destruction and Affliction. Now I'm forced to make a choice. If I'm going into a raid and I know I'm going to play both Destro and Affy, maybe I put my my Crashing Chaos or in spot number 5, but in 15 I put Racking Brilliance because I want to use Affliction on a couple of fights and I want my Racking Brilliance in that particular slot. So now I'm starting to multi-spec and I'm giving myself options. So you're forced early on to make decisions, and you're either spending a lot of gold to constantly respec, or you're just sticking with a particular build or something along the way. But as you do more stuff, and like you can see 15 and 20, by the time I'm level 20 on the neck or whatever, which isn't that insane, or at least I wouldn't make it that insane. Maybe they scale it crazy and they ruin this whole idea. But I would make that someone who's played the game a reasonable amount, but you don't have to be limit to get there before like the raid tier comes out. Now I've got 3 nodes unlocked. So I can either, if I only want to play Destro, I have every Destro option available to me in various combinations. But if I want a multi-spec, now I have the option to put 1 Destruction, 1 Affliction, 1 Demonology in there, and now I can swap with a single tone between any of the specs with that gear that I've got equipped without any fear. And if you screw up and you're angry and you don't like what you took, you come back and you talk to our guy over here. We go and we respec and we pay our 5 gold, 10 gold. Maybe it's 50 gold because you're not going to be respecking as much, but you pay whatever is an appropriately determined amount of gold, and I wipe my piece of gear clean. All the unlocked stuff stays unlocked, obviously, because I've got whatever the neck level is, and now I can slot in different stuff. And so we continue to follow this progression line. So at 25, we're going back into the raid PvP M+ tier. At 30, we're going back to our minor. At 35, we're popping back out. We're getting another class skill. 40, we're getting another raid PvP M+. 45, we're getting another one of our defensives. 50, we're getting another one of the class ones. 55, so on and so forth until we get to 70. At 70, we get the center ring. Boom! It gives us 5 item levels, 10 item levels, whatever it is. It boosts our particular piece of gear. And then this is now the way that Legion, where we had an infinite well of stuff. This is our infinite well, where you have an exponentially increasing power curve so that Azerite power is never meaningless. However, you're not hard forced to try to grind to any particular level. So as long as I keep earning stuff, I'm going to continue to boost the item level of those things, which is going to increase my primary stats on that particular piece of gear, which will inevitably increase my survivability by increasing stam, and will increase my damage output by increasing my intellect. But I'm not forced into grinding ludicrous amounts, re-earning anything crazy along the line, or anything along those lines. That is just a simple idea. I sat down, this Photoshop thing itself took far longer to put together than the actual idea that I had behind this. Now, it's not perfect. There's things that can be argued around it, but I think that's a reasonable redesign that could be put in that would make you actually feel a level of progression. It would make you make some meaningful choices early on, but at the same point, it doesn't completely gimp you in terms of your ability to do anything along the way. Something that would be complained is the alt friendliness of this. Well, you could simply make it where a certain percentage of whatever Azerite you earn on like your main character, if I throw, let's say I get 1,000 Azerite power on my Warlock here. Any alt tied to my WoW account, if I get 1,000 on my Warlock, I get 50 for every character on my account. That certainly would be exploitable, so maybe you put a cap on bonus amounts or whatever, or maybe it's a one-time source thing, so if it's from a particular quest, if I go and I do that quest on my alt, then on the alt, let's say it was 1,000, I already got the 50 or something, I catch up on the quest, and then maybe I get the remaining 9,950, and then my Warlock doesn't benefit from it because it's just a catch-up mechanic at that point. But you're getting percentages, so if I were to swap over, maybe I'm already level 10 or level 15 or level 20 on an alt when I make the decision to change over. I don't know the numbers, I don't know the percentage, I haven't thought that out too much. Literally just thought of that as we came along right now, but some way of sharing experience across your tunes, I think is completely reasonable, and I think would be a worthwhile venture in terms of making a system like that a little bit more accessible. But I don't know. That's my thought. That's just something to go off of here. We're a little over an hour right now, so at this point in time, I want to kind of wrap this thing up and bring it to a close. But hopefully this, sets the tone in terms of what I'm looking for in these kinds of videos, gives you some things to think about. I don't like Azerite as it stands, but I think that there are relatively easy fixes, I guess, for lack of a better term, that could be put in place that could make it feel much less bad without forcing a full-blown redesign. And if you were looking at doing a redesign, I think there's pretty easy ways to keep the system mostly intact, not require tier gear or legendaries to come back, but still be able to transition into something that would be fun and would kind of actually do what I think Azerite was meant to do to begin with. So again, it may be a little bit too late to implement this for 8.25, obviously, because that's already on the PTR or coming to the PTR. 8.3, it'd probably be a stretch to see it, so we're likely looking at a 9.0 kind of thing. But that's why it's worth kind of talking about this kind of stuff now, as we're probably a year out from a new expansion release. And we'll likely be hearing some of the stuff and seeing the PTR or the beta for that or whatever coming sometime, BlizzCon, post-BlizzCon-ish, as we start looking into whatever 9.0 is going to bring. So discussions about this, ideas like this, I think are meaningful now, while there's still time and space within the Blizzard's capacity or whatever to actually make some of those changes before they're hard committed to anything. So hopefully you found this interesting. Hopefully some of my ideas kind of, got you thinking. If you're thinking of stuff, flaws with my idea, or better yet, improvements upon it, because like we said, the whole point of this isn't just criticizing everybody, it's actually coming up with useful, meaningful ways to go forward, then please feel free to jump in the comments below, talk about it. Let's discuss. Let's get a dialogue going. Let's think about things. What can we do? What could we what other things are you thinking? What great ideas do you have? Let's get that dialogue going, and let's find a way to fix Azerite gear. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. One last thing here, just the bit of housekeeping and all that stuff. Like I said before, if you like my videos, please subscribe to my channel. It helps me out a ton as we're trying to grow here and grow this community. Like this video if you find it interesting and informative. Other comments, if you've got something else you'd like to be discussed in a similar capacity to this, please feel free to throw that in the comments below, because I'm looking for ideas. Things I'm thinking about tackling right now is class balance as it exists as a general concept right now, as opposed to just trait balance. Another video may include benthic gear and my thoughts about benthic gear, because I think it does something really interesting, but I think it did it completely wrong. And I think that could be looked at from a different perspective. But any ideas you have, any topics you'd like to see discussed, throw those in the comments below as well. And maybe I'll choose that as one of the next videos to make here. So yet again, thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate you hanging out. Hopefully you'll come back from future videos. Check me out on Twitch, where I stream from time to time. Twitch.tv/Kaz. And thanks again. Appreciate you. Cheers.